Prologue. The night everything changed, then the vast expanse of the Nevada desert, where the stars seem close enough to touch and shadows stretch like fingers across ancient sand. There exists a place that defies explanation. It's a landscape where reality bends, where the impossible becomes plausible, and where a single conversation can shatter everything you thought you knew about the world. This is the story of two men, one a respected journalist, the other a physicist with secrets that could rewrite history. It's the tale of how skepticism crumbled in the face of evidence, how careers were risked for truth, and how the desert winds carried whispers of technologies beyond our comprehension. Picture, if you will, a newsroom in Las Vegas, 1989. The fluorescent lights hum overhead as deadline approaches. Television monitors flicker with the day's events, political scandals, weather forecasts, sports scores. Normal news for normal people living normal lives. But in one corner, a veteran journalist named George Knapp is about to receive a phone call that will change everything. The man on the other end of the line speaks in measured tones, his voice carrying the weight of secrets too dangerous to keep. He claims to work at a facility that doesn't officially exist, reverse engineering technology that shouldn't be possible. His name is Bob Lazar, and his story will transform a skeptical reporter into one of ufology's most important voices. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It began 2 years earlier with another man, another set of impossible claims, and a journalist's curiosity that refused to be silenced. Welcome to the mystery that spans decades, crosses continents, and reaches into the very fabric of what we believe about our place in the universe. This is the story of how doubt became belief, how questions became quests, and how two men from very different worlds found themselves bound together by the greatest secret of all. Chapter 1. The Seed of Doubt. The year was 1987, and George Knapp was living the life of a traditional television journalist, anchoring news broadcasts, interviewing politicians, covering the stories that mattered to the people of Las Vegas. His world was one of facts and verification, sources and documentation. If something couldn't be proven, it didn't make it to air. But the desert has a way of challenging assumptions. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, as Las Vegas awakened under its blanket of perpetual heat, a man walked into KLA's TV carrying a stack of documents that would crack open George Knapp's carefully ordered world. The man's name was John Lear, and he came with an extraordinary pedigree. His father had invented the Learjet. John himself was a former test pilot with connections that ran deep into the aerospace industry. Lear wasn't just any conspiracy theorist stumbling in off the street. He had credibility. Years earlier, he had helped KLA's break the story of the F-117 stealth fitter, revelation that went national and established the station's reputation for uncovering military secrets. When John Lear spoke, people in the newsroom listened, but on this particular morning, Lear wasn't talking about conventional aircraft. The documents he spread across the news director's desk told a different story entirely. They spoke of crashed vehicles from other worlds, of secret treaties with extraterrestrial beings, of technology so advanced it seemed like magic. The papers rustled with promises of the greatest story in human history. They were real. .net day. The managing editor looked at the documents with the practiced eye of a seasoned journalist. His response was swift and decisive. "I'm not doing this story. If it were true, I'd already know about it." But George Knapp was listening from across the newsroom, his journalist's instincts stirring. As Lear prepared to leave, Knapp intercepted him. "Let me take a look at this material," he said, his curiosity overriding his caution. What Knapp saw in those documents was unlike anything he'd encountered in his career. The papers detailed alleged government knowledge of UFOs, described recovery operations of crashed craft, and outlined a conspiracy of silence that reached into the highest levels of power. Some of the information seemed outrageous, impossible to believe, but other details carried the ring of authenticity, the kind of specific technical language that would be difficult to fabricate. Knapp had a decision to make. He could dismiss the documents as the ravings of a deluded mind, or he could dig deeper. The journalist in him, the part that had built a career on asking uncomfortable questions, won out. He invited John Lear to appear on his Sunday morning public affairs show, a sleepy half-hour program that aired at 6 o'clock when most of Las Vegas was still asleep. It seemed like a safe place to explore these extraordinary claims without risking the station's reputation. But the desert had other plans. The moment John Lear began speaking on that quiet Sunday morning, describing secret alien treaties and recovered extraterrestrial technology, the phone lines at KLAS exploded. Viewers who should have been sipping coffee and reading the newspaper were instead calling in, demanding to know more about the man with the incredible story. Who was that guy? They asked, "What's the deal with this UFO stuff? Is it real?" The response was unlike anything Knapp had experienced in his broadcasting career. These weren't casual inquiries, they were urgent, passionate demands for information from people who had been waiting their entire lives for someone to ask these questions publicly. 6 months later, Knapp invited Lear back. The response was even bigger. Phone calls flooded in from across the country. Letters arrived by the dozens. It seemed that beneath the surface of ordinary life, millions of people were harboring the same questions, the same suspicions about what might be hidden in the desert darkness. For his third interview, Lear brought a companion, a man named Bill Cooper, who claimed to have seen even more extraordinary documents during his time in the Navy. Cooper's story was more elaborate, more detailed, and significantly more disturbing than anything Lear had presented. He spoke of underground bases, of alien involvement in human affairs, of a shadow government operating beyond all oversight. The audience response was overwhelming, but Knapp began to sense something troubling about Cooper's claims. Each time the man told his story, the details grew more sensational, the stakes higher, the conspiracy deeper. Anyone who questioned Cooper's narrative soon found themselves labeled as part of the cover-up, including, eventually, George Knapp himself. But during that third interview, John Lear mentioned something that would change everything. He hinted that he knew someone, a scientist, who might actually be working at the mysterious Area 51 facility, someone who might have first-hand knowledge of the alien technology Lear claimed was being studied there. Lear didn't provide a name that day. He simply let the possibility hang in the desert air like heat shimmer on asphalt, visible but untouchable. George Knapp filed the information away in his mind, not knowing that this unnamed scientist would soon become the central figure in the most important story of his career. The man's name was Bob Lazar, and he was about to step out of the shadows with claims that would make John Lear's documents seem like a gentle introduction to the impossible. But first, the desert would test both men's resolve. It would demand sacrifices, challenge their courage, and force them to question everything they thought they knew about truth, reality, and the price of seeking answers in a world built on secrets. The transformation had begun, though neither man realized it yet. In the quiet hum of the television studio, surrounded by the familiar comfort of cameras and microphones. George Knapp was about to discover that some stories choose their journalists, not the other way around, and in the mystery that was building like a desert storm on the horizon, the most extraordinary revelations were yet to come. Chapter 2. The Voice in the Shadows. The call came on an evening when Las Vegas pulsed with its usual electric rhythm, neon signs painting the desert night in impossible colors. George Knapp was preparing for the 5 o'clock newscast at KL, running through the day's stories, the usual mix of local politics, traffic accidents, and weather reports that filled the comfortable routine of broadcast journalism. But routine was about to be shattered. Their scheduled guest for the evening interview segment had failed to appear, leaving a 5-minute hole in the broadcast that needed to be filled. With minutes until airtime, Knapp's mind raced through possible alternatives. Then he remembered John Lear's hint about a scientist who might be working at Area 51. The phone call to Lear was meant to be a desperate measure, a last-minute scramble to fill dead air. Knapp had no way of knowing that at that very moment, in a life far from the television studio, a physicist named Bob Lazar was experiencing his own crisis, a convergence of fear, conscience, and determination that would make him willing to risk everything for the truth Lazar had been through. What he would later describe as the ringer, his life had become a maze of surveillance, intimidation, and psychological warfare. Someone or some organization desperately wanted him to remain silent about what he had witnessed in the underground chambers beneath the Nevada desert. But their pressure had achieved the opposite effect. Instead of cowering, Lazar was ready to speak. "Is your UFO guy around?" Knapp asked Lear. Would he do an interview? The timing was more than coincidence, felt like destiny, when Lazar agreed to appear on the show. He had one non-negotiable condition: his identity must be protected. His face would be obscured, his voice disguised. He would speak from the shadows, a disembodied presence carrying secrets that could rewrite human understanding of technology and our place in the universe. The interview began like any other. Knapp introduced his guest as a scientist with extraordinary claims about work being conducted at classified facilities in the Nevada desert. But from the moment Lazar began speaking, it was clear this was unlike anything that had ever been broadcast on KLA. "I worked at a place called S4, Lazar said, his electronically altered voice carrying across the Las Vegas Valley to thousands of unsuspecting viewers. "It's a facility adjacent to Area 51, built into the mountainside, underground, and what I saw there, 9 flying saucers, disc-shaped craft, each one different from the others. This was technology that came from somewhere else." The words hung in the studio air like smoke from a distant fire. Lazar continued, describing in precise technical detail the propulsion systems he claimed to have studied, the exotic materials he had analyzed, the briefings he had received about the origin of the craft. His descriptions were specific, technical, and delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of a scientist, discussing laboratory results. But it was what came next that transformed the broadcast from unusual to earth-shattering. "I'm coming forward because I'm in fear. For my life," Lazar said. "People don't want this information to come out. They've made that very clear." The phone lines at KLAS exploded. Not the gradual build of interest they'd experienced with John Lear, but an immediate, overwhelming response that left the switchboard operators struggling to keep up. Viewers across the region were calling, demanding to know more about the mysterious scientist and his impossible claims. In the newsroom, chaos reigned. The news director came rushing in, followed by the station manager. "Was that for real?" they demanded. "What's the deal with this story?" George Knapp found himself at the center of a whirlwind he hadn't anticipated. The response to Lazar's interview was unlike anything in the station's history. They had touched something deep in the public consciousness. Hunger for answers about questions that had been whispered about for decades, but never addressed so directly on mainstream television. The station's management faced a dilemma. Class had built its reputation on serious journalism, on stories that could be verified and sources that could be trusted. But here was a tale so extraordinary that traditional journalistic standards seemed inadequate. How do you fact-check claims about extraterrestrial technology? How do you verify the credentials of a man whose identity must remain hidden? Knapp and his news director, Bob Stoll, decided they needed to meet with Lazar face-to-face if they were going to risk the station's reputation on this story. They had to look the man in the eye and judge his credibility for themselves. The meeting was arranged for the following weekend at a discreet location away from prying eyes. When Knapp and Stoll arrived, they found themselves face-to-face with a man who defied their expectations. Bob Lazar wasn't the wild-eyed conspiracy theorist they might have anticipated. He was soft-spoken, articulate, and possessed of a technical knowledge that seemed genuine and deep. For 2 hours, they questioned him about his background, his alleged employment at S4, the details of what he claimed to have witnessed. Lazar answered each question with patience and specificity, never seeming to embellish or exaggerate, never appearing to construct his responses on the fly. When they walked out of that meeting, both journalists were shaken. "Holy shit," Stoll said, voicing what both men were thinking. What if this is true? They faced a journalist's nightmare scenario. If Lazar was telling the truth, they were sitting on the biggest story in human history. If he was lying or deluded, they were about to destroy their careers and their station's reputation by giving credence to an elaborate hoax. But there was something about Lazar that convinced them to take the risk. His consistency, his technical knowledge, his apparent reluctance to be in the spotlight, none of it fit the profile of a typical hoaxer seeking attention and fame. They decided to investigate further, to spend the time and resources necessary to examine Lazar's claims as thoroughly as possible. It was a decision that would consume the next 8 months of George Knapp's life and transform him from a skeptical journalist into one of ufology's most important advocates. But first, they had to understand the broader context of what Lazar was claiming. If extraterrestrial craft were indeed being studied at secret facilities, it would represent the culmination of decades of government interest in unexplained aerial phenomena. Knapp realized he needed to become an expert in a field he had never seriously considered: the study of UFOs. The crash course began immediately. Knapp read everything he could find on the subject, from scientific papers to government documents to the testimonies of witnesses spanning decades. He interviewed researchers, attended conferences, and immersed himself in a world that was far more complex and evidence-based than he had ever imagined. As he delved deeper into the literature, Knapp began to understand that Bob Lazar's story, extraordinary as it was, fit into a larger pattern of government secrecy and public denial that stretched back to the early days of the Cold War. The pieces of a vast puzzle were beginning to emerge from the desert haze, each one more intriguing than the last. But even as Knapp educated himself about UFOs, Bob Lazar's life was becoming increasingly strange and threatening. The physicist would later describe a campaign of harassment and intimidation that seemed designed to drive him to silence or to madness. The question that haunted both men was simple. If Lazar was lying, why were powerful forces apparently so determined to stop him from telling his lie? The answer, when it came, would be more disturbing than either of them could have imagined. Chapter 3. The underground theater beneath the Nevada desert, where the earth holds its secrets close and the sun never penetrates, lies a world that officially does not exist. It's a realm of reinforced concrete and steel, of corridors that stretch into darkness and chambers that house the impossible. This is the underground theater where, according to Bob Lazar, humanity's greatest drama was being performed in absolute secrecy. As George Knapp delved deeper into his investigation, Lazar began to reveal details about S for that painted a picture both fascinating and terrifying. The facility, he claimed, was built into the Papoose Lake mountainside, invisible from the surface except for hidden entrances that could swallow aircraft whole. Inside, a complex of laboratories and hangars housed craft that defied every known law of physics. The physicists' descriptions were precise, almost clinical in their detail. He spoke of 9 different disc-shaped vehicles, each unique in design and apparently representing different stages of technological development. Some were small, barely large enough to accommodate a single occupant. Others were massive, their interiors spacious enough for a crew of beings whose physiology was clearly not human. But it was Lazar's description of the propulsion system that captivated Knapp's scientific curiosity. The craft, Lazar claimed, operated on principles that Earth's scientists had only theorized about. They manipulated gravity itself, creating localized distortions in space-time that allowed them to move in ways that seemed to mock the constraints of inertia and aerodynamics. The key to this impossible technology was an element that shouldn't exist, at least not according to the periodic table as it stood in 1989. Lazar called it element 115, a super-heavy atom that could serve as fuel for reactions that released energy by manipulating the strong nuclear force. In the hands of these craft, matter itself became malleable. Space and time, flexible concepts to be shaped by technology beyond human comprehension. As Lazar spoke, Knapp found himself torn between fascination and skepticism. The claims were extraordinary, yet they were delivered with the precision and confidence of a man describing laboratory procedures he had personally conducted. There were no dramatic flourishes, no appeals to emotion. Just the dry recitation of technical facts by someone who seemed genuinely knowledgeable about advanced physics. But knowledge alone wouldn't be enough to convince the viewing public. Knapp needed verification, some way to corroborate at least parts of Lazar's incredible story. The challenge was daunting. How do you investigate claims about the most classified facility in the world? The answer came from Lazar himself. Despite the apparent security surrounding S4, he had managed to smuggle out more than just information. He had brought friends to witness the test flights. On several occasions, Lazar told Knapp the craft would be taken outside for flight tests in the desert darkness. These tests followed a predictable schedule, and Lazar had used his inside knowledge to bring companions to remote viewing, locations where they could observe the impossible vehicles in action. The witnesses weren't UFO enthusiasts or conspiracy theorists. They were Lazar's friends, ordinary people with no particular interest in extraterrestrial phenomena. Gene Huff, a real estate appraiser. John Lear, despite his controversial claims, remained a credible witness with extensive aviation experience. And most importantly, Lazar's wife and her sister, who had accompanied him on one of these desert vigils. Their testimonies were remarkably consistent. They described seeing lights in the distance that moved in ways no conventional aircraft could duplicate. The objects would hover, motionless, then accelerate to tremendous speeds, change direction instantly without any visible transition period, and perform maneuvers that would have been lethal to any human pilot. For George Knapp, these witness accounts represented the first independent verification of elements of Lazar's story. While they couldn't confirm the existence of alien technology, they did suggest that something unusual was indeed being tested in the Nevada desert, something that exhibited flight characteristics unlike any known aircraft. But verification of Lazar's claims would require more than witness testimony. Knapp needed to examine the physicist's background to determine whether he possessed the credentials necessary to work on such advanced projects. This investigation would lead him into one of the most frustrating aspects of the Lazar case: the apparent systematic erasure of the man's educational and employment history. According to Lazar, he had studied at the California Institute of Technology and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earning advanced degrees in physics and electronics. He claimed to have worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory on classified projects before being recruited for the even more sensitive work at S-4. But when Knapp contacted these institutions, he encountered a pattern of denial that seemed to coordinated to be coincidental. Caltech had no record of Robert Lazar. MIT claimed never to have heard of him. Los Alamos National Laboratory insisted that no such person had ever been employed there. The denials might have ended the investigation, if not for one crucial piece of evidence that Lazar himself had preserved. In his personal files, he had kept a copy of the Los Alamos phone directory from his time at the laboratory. There, on page 104, was his name, his telephone extension, and his department affiliation. Knapp also discovered a newspaper article from the Los Alamos Monitor, dated June 27, 1982. The front page story featured Bob Lazar and his jet-powered car, identifying him as a physicist at the Los Alamos Meson Physics Facility. The article included a photograph of Lazar with his experimental vehicle, described his work with high-energy particle accelerators, and quoted colleagues who clearly knew him well. Here was documented proof that at least part of Lazar's background was real. He had indeed worked at Los Alamos, despite the laboratory's subsequent denials. The question was, why would a prestigious national laboratory lie about a former employee? The answer, when it came, would reveal the first cracks in the wall of official secrecy that surrounded not just Bob Lazar, but the entire network of classified facilities that dotted the Nevada desert like stars in a constellation of state secrets. But even as Knapp gathered evidence to support Lazar's credibility, the physicist's life was becoming increasingly surreal. The harassment that had begun before his first television interview was escalating, taking forms that seemed designed more to intimidate than to investigate. Lazar would return home to find his house had been entered, but nothing stolen. Windows would be left open, furniture slightly rearranged, personal items moved in ways that made it clear someone had been inside. His car was broken into repeatedly, doors and windows left open as if to send a message: "We can reach you anywhere, anytime." The psychological pressure was immense, but it had an unexpected effect. Rather than driving Lazar to silence, the harassment convinced both him and Knapp that the story was too important to suppress. If powerful interests were working so hard to keep Lazar quiet, what did that suggest about the truth of his claims? The decision to proceed with the full investigation and ultimately to reveal Lazar's identity was not made lightly. Both men understood the risks. For Lazar, it meant stepping permanently out of the shadows, becoming forever associated with claims that would either vindicate him as a truth-teller or brand him as a delusional fabricator. For Knapp, the stakes were equally high. His reputation, built over decades of careful journalism, would be tied forever to this extraordinary story. If Lazar proved to be a hoax, Knapp's career would likely be over. But in the underground theater of S4, if such a place truly existed, a drama was playing out that was too important to ignore. The question of whether humanity was alone in the universe, and whether governments were concealing evidence of contact with other intelligences, demanded an answer as the investigation moved toward its climactic revelation. Both men were about to discover that some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. And some truths, once revealed, change everything that comes after. The desert was preparing to yield its greatest secret, but at a price neither man could fully anticipate. Chapter 4. The Pilgrimage to Los Alamos in the crisp mountain air of northern New Mexico, where atomic secrets were born and the future of warfare was forged in laboratories carved from mesa stone. George Knapp and his camera crew made a pilgrimage that would forever alter their understanding of Bob Lazar's credibility. Los Alamos National Laboratory, the birthplace of the atomic bomb, the fortress of nuclear science, was about to provide one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. The journey to Los Alamos wasn't planned as a dramatic revelation. Knapp simply needed to verify Lazar's claim that he had worked there, to see if the physicist's knowledge of the facility was genuine or fabricated. What happened next would demonstrate either the depth of Lazar's deception or the extent of the cover-up surrounding his true identity as their vehicle wound through the mountain roads leading to the laboratory. Lazar seemed relaxed, almost casual. This wasn't the behavior of a man preparing to bluff his way through a facility where he'd never worked. Instead, he displayed the easy familiarity of someone returning to a familiar workplace after a brief absence. The first test came at the security checkpoint. Los Alamos was, and remains, one of America's most secure facilities. Every visitor is screened, every movement monitored. For someone without legitimate business at the laboratory, even approaching the main gate would likely trigger an investigation. But when Lazar approached the guards, something extraordinary happened. He was recognized. Security personnel who had known him during his previous employment greeted him warmly, waving the news crew through without the extensive background checks typically required for media access. "Bob, good to see you again," one guard called out, as if greeting an old friend rather than someone the laboratory officially claimed had never existed. Inside the facility, the evidence of Lazar's authentic connection to Los Alamos became even more compelling. He navigated the complex with the confidence of someone who had walked these corridors many times before. He knew shortcuts between buildings, understood the layout of laboratories, and demonstrated familiarity with procedures that would be impossible to fake. Most remarkably, as Lazar led the camera crew through the facility, he encountered former colleagues who clearly remembered working with him. These weren't brief, superficial encounters. These were conversations between people who had shared projects, discussed technical problems, and developed professional relationships over months or years of collaboration. "Hey, Bob, how's the jet car project going?" one physicist asked, referring to the rocket-powered vehicle that Lazar had built as a side project during his time at the laboratory. The interaction was natural, unforced, the kind of casual workplace conversation that cannot be staged or rehearsed. For George Knapp, watching these encounters unfold, the implications were staggering. If Los Alamos truly had no record of Bob Lazar, if he had never been employed there, as officials claimed, then how could he walk through the facility like a returning employee? How could security guards recognize him? How could former colleagues greet him by name and ask about specific projects they had worked on together? The camera crew was allowed to film inside sensitive areas of the laboratory, a privilege that would never be granted to an outsider. Lazar demonstrated detailed knowledge of equipment, described research projects with technical precision, and displayed the kind of intimate familiarity with the facility that could only come from extensive hands-on experience. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Lazar encountered Dr. Edward Teller, the legendary physicist known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. Teller not only recognized Lazar, but engaged him in conversation about technical matters, treating him as a peer rather than a stranger. The interaction between Lazar and Teller was brief but significant. Here was one of the most distinguished physicists of the 20th century, a man whose time was precious and whose security clearances were at the highest levels, speaking with someone the laboratory claimed had never existed. As the Los Alamos visit concluded, Knapp found himself grappling with a disturbing reality. Either Bob Lazar was the most sophisticated hoaxer in history, capable of fooling security guards, former colleagues, and legendary scientists, or powerful institutions were systematically lying about his background and employment. The evidence from Los Alamos didn't prove that Lazar had worked on alien technology at S4, but it did establish that he was far more than the fabricator his critics claimed. He was a legitimate physicist with genuine connections to some of America's most classified research facilities. This revelation cast his claims about S4 in a new light. If Lazar truly had the scientific credentials and security clearances necessary to work on advanced classified projects, then his recruitment for even more sensitive work became plausible. The gap between his proven background and his extraordinary claims suddenly seemed less impossible to bridge. But the Los Alamos evidence also raised troubling questions about the nature of official secrecy in America. If institutions could so thoroughly erase someone's documented employment history, what other information might be subject to such systematic revision? How many other scientists, engineers, or technicians had been disappeared from the historical record to protect classified projects? For George Knapp, the implications extended far beyond the Bob Lazar story. He was glimpsing a shadow world where truth was malleable, where official records could be altered or destroyed to serve the needs of classification. It was a realm where the normal tools of journalism, document verification, institutional confirmation, official statements could not be trusted. The drive back from Los Alamos was conducted largely in silence. Both Knapp and Lazar seemed to understand that they had crossed a threshold. The physicist's credibility was no longer the primary question. The real issue had become the credibility of the institutions that were denying his existence. But even as this evidence accumulated, the pressure on both men was intensifying. Lazar's harassment was becoming more sophisticated, more personal, and Knapp was beginning to understand that his investigation was attracting attention from quarters that had the power to make his professional life very difficult. The story was developing momentum that neither man could control. Like a boulder rolling down a mountain slope, it was gathering speed and weight, threatening to sweep away everything in its path, including the careers and reputations of those who had set it in motion, as they descended from the mountains of New Mexico back toward the desert valleys of Nevada. Both men knew they were approaching a point of no return. The evidence they had gathered was too compelling to ignore, too dangerous to publish, and too important to suppress. The decision to proceed would require courage that went beyond normal journalistic risk-taking. They were about to challenge not just government secrecy, but the fundamental assumptions about reality that governed most people's understanding of the world. In the distance, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly under the vast sky, its secrets buried beneath layers of sand, time, and classification stamps that might never be lifted. But somewhere in that wilderness, if Bob Lazar was telling the truth, lay evidence that would rewrite humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. The question was no longer whether the story was true. The question was whether two men had the courage to tell it. Chapter 5. The network of silence. In the weeks following Bob Lazar's shadow interview, George Knapp made a decision that would prove both illuminating and dangerous. He put out a public call for other potential whistleblowers, inviting anyone with knowledge of unusual activities at Area 51 or related facilities to come forward. It was a standard journalistic practice, seeking additional sources to corroborate extraordinary claims. What happened next revealed the existence of something far more sinister than simple government secrecy. It exposed a network of surveillance and intimidation that operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine and the ruthlessness of an organization that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. The response to Knapp's request was immediate. Within days of his public appeal, 6 different individuals contacted him, each claiming to have information about unusual activities at classified facilities in the Nevada desert. These weren't UFO enthusiasts or they were ordinary professionals whose work had brought them into contact with the edges of something extraordinary. The first was a tax preparer who had developed relationships with personnel from Nellis Air Force Base through his accounting practice. Over the years, his clients had shared stories that seemed too bizarre to be true. Accounts of crashed objects that weren't from any earthly source, of recovery operations conducted under the strictest secrecy, of technology that defied explanation. Another was a golf instructor at Nellis who had accompanied officers on recreational trips into the desert. During these outings, in moments of relaxation and trust, his military clients had spoken of strange phenomena they had witnessed at remote testing sites. Objects that moved without visible propulsion, craft that seemed to ignore the laws of physics, activities that were never to be discussed outside the most classified circles. A third source was a court stenographer who had previously worked for a defense contractor called Holmes and Nava. In that capacity, she had sat in on meetings between military officials and corporate executives, transcribing conversations about recovered materials and reverse engineering projects. After each session, she was instructed to destroy the transcripts and surrender her notes, an unusual practice that suggested that discussions involved information too sensitive for normal, classified document procedures. Each of these sources had agreed to provide information to Knapp, understanding that their identities would be protected and their safety assured. They were ordinary citizens whose jobs had given them glimpses of extraordinary activities. People with no particular agenda beyond a desire to see the truth revealed. But within 24 hours of their phone conversations with Knapp, each one received a visit. The pattern was identical in every case. 2 men in dark suits would appear at the source's home or workplace. They would identify themselves vaguely as federal agents, though they rarely provided specific credentials. Their message was simple and direct. The person had been speaking about matters that remained classified, and such discussions needed to stop immediately. The visits weren't subtle. They were designed to intimidate, to demonstrate that privacy was an illusion and that powerful eyes were always watching. The agents knew personal details about the sources' lives, where their children went to school, where their relatives lived, what routes they took to work. The implication was clear. Cooperation with journalists investigating classified matters would have consequences that extended far beyond the individual making the disclosure. The stenographer received, perhaps the most chilling visit. The two agents who came to her door didn't just warn her about discussing her past work. They mentioned her daughter in Los Angeles, described her regular visits to see her mother, and made an observation that sent ice through her veins. It's a big desert out there. It would be terrible if something happened to either one of you. For George Knapp, the systematic intimidation of his sources represented a turning point in the investigation. These weren't random coincidences or misunderstandings. Someone with significant resources and authority was monitoring his inquiries and moving swiftly to silence anyone who might provide corroborating information. That revelation was both frightening and validating. If Lazar's claims were mere fantasy, why would powerful interests be so concerned about preventing other witnesses from coming forward? The very fact that intimidation tactics were being employed suggested that there was something significant to hide. But the source, intimidation, also revealed the magnitude of the forces arrayed against the investigation. This wasn't simply a matter of challenging government policy or exposing bureaucratic incompetence. Knapp was confronting an apparatus of secrecy that operated outside normal legal constraints, an organization with the power to monitor communications, track movements, and threaten citizens with impunity. The nature of the surveillance became clear through other incidents that occurred during this period. Lazar reported that his phone conversations were being monitored, often with such poor technique that the electronic interference was audible to both parties. His mail was being opened and resealed. His movements were being tracked by unmarked vehicles that made no attempt to remain covert. The harassment extended to psychological warfare designed to undermine Lazar's mental stability. His home would be entered during his absence, but nothing would be stolen. Instead, small items would be moved, furniture slightly rearranged, windows left open in specific patterns. The message was clear. We can reach you anywhere. We know everything about your life, and your sense of security is entirely dependent on our sufferance. For Knapp, witnessing this campaign of intimidation was profoundly disturbing. As a journalist, he had always operated under the assumption that truth-seeking was a protected activity in America, that sources could be shielded from retaliation, that the press served as a bulwark against government overreach. The Lazar case was revealing that these assumptions were dangerously naive when dealing with matters of the highest classification. The systematic nature of the intimidation suggested an organization with virtually unlimited resources and authority. Phone calls were monitored within hours of being placed. Movements were tracked in real time. Personal information was gathered and deployed as psychological weapons. This wasn't the work of a few rogue agents operating outside the system. It was the system itself, functioning with terrifying efficiency. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the part intimidation campaign was its effectiveness. One by one, Knapp's sources withdrew their offers of cooperation. The tax preparer suddenly claimed he had been mistaken about the stories his clients had told him. The golf instructor insisted he had misremembered the conversations during those desert excursions. The stenographer disappeared entirely, her phone disconnected, her apartment abandoned, within weeks of putting out his public call for information. Knapp found himself more isolated than when he had started. The network of potential corroboration had been systematically dismantled by forces that operated in the shadows but wielded power in the light. Yet in a perverse way, the intimidation campaign provided its own form of validation. If the claims about S4 and alien technology were simply the delusions of a disturbed physicist, why would such extraordinary measures be taken to prevent corroboration? Why would powerful interests risk exposure by engaging in activities that bordered on domestic terrorism? The answer, Knapp began to suspect, lay in the nature of the secret being protected. This wasn't simply another classified military project or weapons development program. This was something that struck at the very foundation of human understanding. Something so profound that its revelation would require a fundamental reassessment of humanity's place in the universe. But knowledge of the intimidation campaign also served as a warning. If Knapp proceeded with his investigation, if he chose to broadcast Lazar's claims to a wider audience, he would be challenging forces that had demonstrated their willingness to use extreme measures to protect their secrets. The stakes had escalated far beyond journalism into a realm where careers, reputations, and possibly lives hung in the balance. The decision to continue would require not just professional courage, but personal bravery of the highest order. Knapp was being forced to choose between his safety and his duty as a journalist, between the comfortable world of conventional news reporting and the dangerous territory of truth-telling about matters that powerful interests desperately wanted to keep hidden. As he weighed his options, sitting in the familiar environment of the KLAS newsroom, surrounded by the ordinary tools of broadcast journalism, Knapp understood that he was facing a moment that would define not just his career but his character. The desert beyond the studio windows held secrets that could change everything. But accessing those secrets would require a courage that went far beyond anything he had previously been asked to demonstrate. The network of silence was vast and powerful, but it was not impenetrable. Somewhere in its structure were weaknesses, contradictions, and human elements that might be persuaded to choose truth over secrecy. The question was whether George Knapp had the skill, determination, and sheer audacity to find those weaknesses and exploit them. The investigation was entering its most dangerous phase, where the stakes were no longer measured in ratings or reputation. Chapter 6. The element of impossibility deep within the laboratories of S4. If Bob Lazar's accounts were to be believed, humanity was confronting a mystery that challenged every fundamental assumption about the nature of matter itself. At the heart of this mystery was an element that shouldn't exist according to conventional physics, a super-heavy atom that Lazar designated as element 115, possessing properties that seemed to mock the established laws of nuclear science. As George Knapp delved deeper into the technical aspects of Lazar's claims, he found himself entering a realm where science fiction and scientific possibility blurred into an indistinguishable haze. The physicist's descriptions of element 115 were precise and detailed, delivered with the confidence of someone who had personally observed its properties and witnessed its impossible applications. According to Lazar, element 115 existed in a region of nuclear stability that theoretical physicists had only speculated about, while elements beyond uranium were known to be increasingly unstable, decaying within fractions of a second. Element 115 apparently possessed a unique nuclear configuration that rendered it stable over extended periods. This stability, combined with its extreme atomic mass, gave it properties that conventional science insisted were impossible. The most extraordinary claim was that element 115 could be used as fuel for a propulsion system that manipulated gravity itself. When bombarded with protons in a specially designed reactor, the element would undergo reactions that didn't just release energy, they created distortions in the gravitational field surrounding the craft. These distortions, according to Lazar, allowed the vehicles to effectively fall through space, moving by warping the very fabric of space-time, rather than pushing against it through conventional thrust. For Knapp, evaluating these claims required a crash course in nuclear physics that left him both fascinated and bewildered. The concepts Lazar described were at the very edge of theoretical possibility, involving phenomena that mainstream science acknowledged might exist but had never successfully demonstrated. The physicists' explanations involved terms and principles that were real and accurate, even if their application seemed to transcend current human capabilities. But what made Lazar's technical descriptions particularly compelling was their internal consistency. Unlike many UFO stories that relied on vague references to advanced technology, Lazar provided detailed explanations of how the propulsion systems worked, what materials were involved, and why conventional physics couldn't account for the observed phenomena. His descriptions formed a coherent technical narrative that, while extraordinary, wasn't internally contradictory. The element 115 story also provided a testable prediction. Lazar claimed that Earth's scientists would eventually discover and synthesize this element, though in tiny quantities that would be far too unstable to exhibit the properties he described. The element would exist for only milliseconds before decaying, but its temporary existence would prove that the theoretical framework underlying Lazar's claims was sound. This prediction would prove remarkably prescient. In 2003, 14 years after Lazar's initial claims, scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Russia successfully synthesized element 115, which was later officially named moscovium. While the synthesized element was indeed highly unstable, lasting only milliseconds before decay, its very existence validated at least part of Lazar's technical narrative. For supporters of Lazar's story, the eventual discovery of element 115 represented vindication of the physicist's credibility. How could he have accurately predicted the existence of an element that wouldn't be synthesized for another decade and a half unless he had actually encountered it in stable form? The prediction seemed to demonstrate knowledge that was beyond the scientific understanding available in 1989. Skeptics, however, pointed out that the synthesized element bore little resemblance to Lazar's stable, gravity-manipulating fuel source. The moscovium created in laboratories decayed almost instantly and showed no unusual gravitational properties. The discovery proved that element 115 could theoretically exist, but not that it possessed the extraordinary characteristics Lazar claimed to have observed. Yet for George Knapp, the technical consistency of Lazar's claims remained compelling regardless of later scientific developments. The physicist's descriptions demonstrated a deep understanding of nuclear physics and theoretical principles that would be difficult to fake. His explanations of how alien propulsion systems might work were creative, technically sophisticated, and internally, logically the product of an elaborate hoax. The element 115 story also raised profound questions about the nature of scientific knowledge and discovery. If advanced civilizations had indeed mastered the stable production of super-heavy elements, What other fundamental principles of physics might they have learned to manipulate? What technologies might be possible for beings whose understanding of matter and energy transcended current human limitations? But perhaps the most disturbing implication of the Element 115 story was what it suggested about the pace of human scientific development. If such materials and technologies were indeed being studied in secret facilities, why wasn't this knowledge being shared with the broader scientific community? What justified keeping discoveries that could revolutionize human understanding hidden from the very scientists who might be able to advance them further? The answers to these questions led into even darker territory, the possibility that scientific progress itself was being controlled and manipulated by interests that prioritized secrecy over advancement, power over knowledge. If the Element 115 story was true, it meant that humanity's understanding of physics was decades or centuries behind what was actually possible, held back not by natural limitations, but by artificial constraints imposed by those who controlled access to extraordinary technologies. For Bob Lazar, the Element 115 story was just one piece of a larger puzzle that included craft design, propulsion principles, and even briefings about the beings who had allegedly created these technologies. But for George Knapp, it represented something even more significant, if that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than conventional science acknowledged, and that powerful interests were working to ensure that this knowledge remained forever hidden from public view. The investigation was revealing layer upon layer of secrecy, each one more profound than the last. Behind the security fences and classification stamps lay secrets that could rewrite textbooks, reshape civilization, and fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. But these revelations came with a price that was becoming increasingly apparent. The closer they came to exposing the truth, the more dangerous their situation became. The forces protecting these secrets had demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation, harassment, and worse, to maintain their control over information that they deemed too sensitive for public consumption. As Knapp prepared to broadcast the full story to the world, he understood that he was not simply reporting on an unusual claim about alien technology. He was challenging a system of secrecy so vast and powerful that it could reshape reality itself, creating official truths that bore no resemblance to actual facts and maintaining those fictions through methods that democracy would never openly tolerate. The element of impossibility wasn't just in the exotic matter Lazar claimed to have studied. It was in the very idea that such momentous secrets could be kept in a democratic society, that scientific breakthroughs of cosmic significance could remain hidden while humanity struggled with energy crises and environmental challenges that these technologies might easily resolve. The story was approaching its climax, but the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. Chapter 7. The 9 Chambers of Wondering, the deepest recesses of S4. According to Bob Lazar's increasingly detailed accounts, lay 9 chambers that housed the most extraordinary collection of technology ever assembled on Earth. Each chamber contained a different craft, each vehicle representing what appeared to be a different stage in the development of technologies that transcended human understanding. These were not merely advanced aircraft, they were glimpses into possibilities that challenged every assumption about physics, engineering, and the very nature of reality itself. As George Knapp listened to Lazar's descriptions of these craft, he found himself struggling to visualize technologies that seemed to exist at the intersection of science and magic. The physicist's accounts were precise and technical, yet they described machines that performed feats that conventional science insisted were impossible. The smallest of the craft, which Lazar designated as the sport model, was roughly 52 feet in diameter and 16 feet in height. Its design was elegantly simpler, smooth, seamless disc with no visible joints, seams, or external components. The hull appeared to be constructed from a metallic alloy that had never been identified, possessing properties that allowed it to become transparent under certain conditions. When powered down, the craft looked solid and impenetrable. When activated, sections of the hull could become as clear as glass, providing occupants with an unobstructed view of their surroundings. But it was the craft's propulsion system that truly defied comprehension. 3 gravity amplifiers, positioned at equal intervals around the vehicle's perimeter, could create focused gravitational fields that allowed the craft to move by falling toward a point in space that it had artificially created. This wasn't propulsion in any conventional sense. It was a manipulation of space-time itself that allowed the vehicle to travel vast distances without experiencing the effects of acceleration or inertia. The larger craft in the facility were even more extraordinary. Some were massive vehicles capable of accommodating dozens of occupants, their interiors designed for beings whose physiology was clearly not human. The seats were too small for adult humans, positioned at angles that would be uncomfortable for terrestrial anatomy. The control surfaces were configured for hands that possessed more fingers than the human standard, suggesting that these machines had been built by and for intelligences that had evolved under very different conditions. Described in detail the archaeological approach that human scientists were taking to understand these technologies. Since the craft came with no instruction manuals or technical documentation, reverse engineering them required painstaking analysis of every component, every system, every design element. Scientists would carefully disassemble sections of the vehicles, study individual components under electron microscopes, and attempt to reproduce the materials and manufacturing processes that had created them. The work was frustratingly slow and often dangerous. The craft's power systems used materials and energy sources that could be lethal if mishandled. Several accidents had occurred during the reverse engineering process, incidents that had resulted in injuries and, in at least one case, according to Lazar, the death of a researcher who had been exposed to radiation from an improperly handled power cell. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Lazar's accounts was what they suggested about the origin of these technologies. The craft weren't simply advanced versions of human engineering. They represented a completely different approach to the problems of flight, power generation, and space travel. They were, in every sense, alien technologies that had been created by intelligences whose understanding of physics was centuries or millennia ahead of human capabilities. Briefings that Lazar claimed to have received at S4 provided even more extraordinary context for the technology he was studying. According to these classified presentations, the craft had been recovered from crash sites over a period of decades. They represented evidence of ongoing visitation to Earth by beings from other star systems, visitation that had been occurring for far longer than the government had ever publicly acknowledged. The briefings described a complex history of contact and conflict, of crashed vehicles and recovered materials, of attempts to understand technologies that operated on principles that human science was only beginning to glimpse. Some of the craft had been found intact, their occupants dead, but their technology still functional. Others had been recovered in pieces, requiring extensive reconstruction before their systems could be studied. For George Knapp, These descriptions of the 9 chambers created a picture of a secret scientific program that dwarfed anything in human history. If Lazar's accounts were accurate, the most significant technological advancement in human civilization was occurring in complete secrecy, hidden from the scientific community that should have been leading such research, and from the public that had a right to know about discoveries that could reshape the future of human civilization. The implications were staggering. If alien technologies were indeed being reverse-engineered at secret facilities, the breakthroughs achieved could revolutionize energy production, transportation, materials, science, and dozens of other fields. Humanity's greatest challenges, from climate change to resource depletion to space exploration, could potentially be addressed using principles and technologies that were being studied in the 9 chambers beneath the Nevada desert. Yet this knowledge was apparently being withheld not just from the public, but from the broader scientific community that might be able to accelerate the reverse engineering process. The secrecy meant that only a tiny group of cleared researchers had access to these extraordinary technologies, limiting the rate of progress and ensuring that breakthroughs that could benefit all humanity remained locked away in classified facilities. The rationale for such extreme secrecy was itself a matter of speculation. Did the controlling authorities believe that humanity wasn't ready for such advanced technologies? Were they concerned that public knowledge of alien visitation would cause social disruption or religious upheaval? Or were there darker motivations, the desire to maintain technological superiority, to control the pace of human development, or to profit from the gradual release of advanced capabilities? For Bob Lazar, working in the 9 chambers had been simultaneously the greatest privilege and the greatest burden of his scientific career. He had been given access to technologies that represented the pinnacle of scientific achievement, but he was forbidden from sharing that knowledge with anyone outside the program. He was witnessing discoveries that could transform human civilization, but he was powerless to ensure that those discoveries would ever benefit the people whose taxes funded the research. The psychological pressure of maintaining such secrets while witnessing such wonders had ultimately proven unbearable. The harassment campaign that followed his attempts to speak out only reinforced his conviction that the public had a right to know about research that was being conducted in their name with their money for purposes that remained undefined and possibly contrary to human welfare. As Knapp prepared to broadcast these accounts to the world, he understood that he was about to reveal not just the existence of extraordinary technologies, but evidence of a level of government secrecy that challenged the very foundations of democratic governance. If such momentous discoveries could be kept hidden from public scrutiny, what did that say about the real distribution of power in American society? The 9 chambers of wonder were not just repositories of alien technology, they were symbols of a shadow world where the most important decisions about humanity's future were being made by people whose identities, motivations, and ultimate goals remained hidden from those who had elected them to serve the public interest. The desert was about to yield its greatest secrets, but those secrets would come wrapped in questions that might prove even more disturbing than the extraordinary technologies they had helped to create. Chapter 8: The Watchers and the Watch-Tin. The months leading up to the broadcasts that would introduce Bob Lazar to the world. Both he and George Knapp entered a shadow world where privacy became an illusion and paranoia evolved from a mental disorder into a survival skill. The campaign of surveillance and intimidation that surrounded the investigation revealed an apparatus of control so sophisticated and pervasive that it challenged every assumption about freedom. and civil liberties in America. The watchers were everywhere, yet they were nowhere. They operated with the invisibility of ghosts and the persistence of machines, monitoring communications, tracking movements, and documenting associations with a thoroughness that would have impressed the Stasi for Lazar and Knapp. Every phone call became a potential security breach, every meeting a possible trap, every decision a calculation that weighed truth-telling against personal safety. Bob Lazar's harassment had evolved from crude intimidation tactics to sophisticated psychological warfare. The break-ins at his home became more frequent and more brazen, but also more subtle in their execution. Nothing was ever stolen that would have been too simple, too easily explained as ordinary crime. Instead, the intruders left calling cards, a window opened in a specific pattern, a book moved from one shelf to another, a photograph turned face down on a table. The message was clear. We know where you live. We know your habits. We know what matters to you. Your sense of security is entirely dependent on our restraint. The psychological impact was devastating. Lazar found himself constantly checking and rechecking his home, looking for signs of intrusion, wondering if his most private spaces had been violated. Sleep became elusive. Trust became impossible. The simple pleasure of returning home at the end of the day was replaced by anxiety about what new evidence of surveillance he might discover. His car became another vehicle for intimidation. Doors would be found unlocked when he was certain he had secured them. Windows would be rolled down in patterns that couldn't be explained by mechanical failure. On several occasions, he discovered that his vehicle had been moved slightly from where he had parked it, shifted just enough to be noticeable, but not enough to be reported as theft. The surveillance extended to his workplace, his social activities, and his family relationships. People in his life began reporting strange phone calls and unusual encounters. Friends mentioned seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked near their homes. After they had been in contact with Lazar, family members received visits from individuals claiming to conduct surveys or inspections that seemed designed more to gather information than to serve any legitimate purpose. For George Knapp, the harassment was more subtle but no less pervasive. His phone calls were monitored with such poor technique that the electronic interference was often audible to both parties. His mail delivery became irregular, with some items arriving weeks late and others never reaching their destination at all. His sources began reporting that they had been contacted by federal agents asking about their conversations with the KLA's reporter, but perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the surveillance was its obvious coordination. The harassment of Lazar and Knapp wasn't the work of a single agency or organization. It required cooperation between multiple entities with different jurisdictions and capabilities. Phone monitoring required one set of resources and authorities. Physical surveillance demanded another. The intimidation of sources involved, yet different, capabilities and legal frameworks. The scale of the operation suggested involvement at the highest levels of the intelligence community. This wasn't a rogue operation, conducted by a few overzealous agents. It was a systematic campaign that required approval and coordination from senior officials who had access to extraordinary resources and authorities. The revelation was both frightening and validating. If the Lazar story was merely the delusion of a disturbed physicist, why would such extraordinary measures be taken to suppress it? Why would powerful interests risk exposure by engaging in activities that violated numerous federal laws and constitutional protections? The very existence of the harassment campaign suggested that there was something of enormous importance at stake, something that justified methods that no democratic society would openly tolerate. But the surveillance also served as a constant reminder of the risks involved in pursuing the story. Both Lazar and Knapp were forced to confront the reality that their government possessed capabilities and demonstrated a willingness to use them in ways that most Americans would find shocking and unacceptable. Every conversation became a potential intelligence windfall for unknown listeners. Every meeting required operational security measures that seemed more appropriate for foreign espionage than domestic journalism. Every decision to proceed with the investigation had to account for the possibility that powerful interests were actively working to undermine their efforts and discredit their findings. The psychological pressure was immense. Both men found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering who might be watching, questioning whether their phones were secure, analyzing every unexpected encounter for signs of intelligence gathering. The stress of living under such conditions was beginning to take its toll on their health, their relationships, and their ability to function normally in society. Yet paradoxically, the harassment also strengthened their resolve. The extraordinary measures being taken to silence them served as confirmation that they were pursuing something of genuine importance. If the story was false, if Lazar's claims were merely the product of delusion or deception, why would such resources be devoted to suppressing them? The watchers had overplayed their hand. Instead of intimidating Lazar and Knapp into silence, they had provided evidence that the claims being made were significant enough to justify methods that operated outside the normal boundaries of law and constitutional protection. As the investigation approached its public revelation, both men understood that they were not simply telling a story about alien technology and government secrecy. They were exposing a system of control that operated in the shadows of American democracy, a parallel structure of power that could monitor citizens, intimidate sources, and manipulate information with impunity. The story of Bob Lazar and S4 had become inseparable from larger questions about the nature of government power, the limits of classification, authority, and the fundamental question of whether democratic societies could survive when their most important secrets were protected by methods that democracy itself would never approve. The desert was about to reveal more than just alien technology and classified facilities. It was about to expose the existence of a shadow government that operated by its own rules, answered to no elected authority, and considered itself accountable only to interests that remained hidden from those who supposedly controlled the democratic process. The watchers were about to become the watched, their methods exposed to the scrutiny of a public that had never been asked to consent to such surveillance and would never approve of such tactics if given a choice. The greatest revelation was yet to come, but it might not be the one that either Lazar or Knapp had expected when they first began their journey into the heart of America's deepest secrets. Chapter 9. The Broadcast That Changed. Everything November 1989. Las Vegas pulsed with its eternal neon rhythm as George Knapp sat in the KLA's television studio, preparing to broadcast a story that would either establish his reputation as one of journalism's most important investigators or destroy his career in spectacular fashion. 8 months of investigation, hundreds of hours of interviews, and a level of personal risk that went far beyond normal reporting had led to this moment. The decision to reveal Bob Lazar's identity and present his full story to the public had not been made lightly. Both men understood that there would be no going back once the physicist's face appeared on television screens across the Las Vegas Valley. The protection of anonymity would be lost forever, replaced by the harsh scrutiny of public attention and the continued harassment of those who desperately wanted his story suppressed. But the evidence had become too compelling to ignore, the implications too significant to suppress. If Lazar was telling the truth, the accumulated evidence suggested he was then the public had a right to know about research being conducted in their name, with their tax dollars, for purposes that remained undefined and potentially contrary to human welfare. The 9-part series that began that November evening would transform not just the careers of the men who created it, but the entire landscape of UFO research and government accountability. UFOs, the best evidence, represented something unprecedented in television journalism, a mainstream news organization lending its credibility to claims that challenged the fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. From the moment the first segment aired, the response was overwhelming. The KLA switchboard was flooded with calls from viewers who had been waiting their entire lives for someone with institutional credibility to address these questions seriously. The audience grew each night, defying every expectation about public interest in such extraordinary claims. But it wasn't just the size of the audience that surprised Knapp, it was their sophistication. These weren't the credulous believers or conspiracy theorists that critics might have expected. They were engineers, scientists, military personnel, and ordinary citizens who had their own encounters with unexplained phenomena and had never found anyone willing to investigate their stories seriously. Many callers provided additional information that corroborated elements of Lazar's account. Former military personnel confirmed the existence of facilities in areas where no installations were supposed to exist. Engineers described technologies they had worked on that seemed to relate to the propulsion systems Lazar had described. Scientists shared their own theories about the physics principles that might explain the observed phenomena. The series also attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Government officials, who normally refused to comment on classified matters, found themselves forced to respond to specific allegations about facilities, programs, and activities that were supposedly non-existent. Their responses often raised more questions than they answered, using careful language that denied nothing while confirming nothing. Most tellingly, the Pentagon's response to the series was not to dismiss it as fantasy, but to emphasize that discussing classified activities, regardless of their nature, remained a violation of security agreements and federal law. The implication was clear. Whether or not Lazar's specific claims were accurate, he had indeed been involved in classified activities that the government preferred to keep secret. The series also revealed the existence of a community of witnesses and insiders who had been waiting for someone like Lazar to break the silence. In the weeks following the broadcasts, Knapp was contacted by dozens of individuals who claimed to have their own knowledge of unusual activities at Area 51 and related facilities. While many of these claims proved to be unsubstantiated, others provided additional pieces of a puzzle that was far larger and more complex than anyone had initially realized. International attention followed quickly. The story was picked up by news organizations around the world, translated into dozens of languages, and distributed through early computer networks that were precursors to the modern internet. For the first time in history, claims about government knowledge of alien technology were being treated as legitimate news, rather than tabloid entertainment. The response from the scientific community was mixed, but significant. While many researchers dismissed Lazar's claims as impossible, Others found elements of his technical descriptions intriguing enough to warrant further investigation. The physicist's predictions about element 115, in particular, were noted by nuclear researchers who would later validate at least the theoretical possibility of his claims. But perhaps the most important impact of the series was its effect on government secrecy itself. The unprecedented public attention forced officials to acknowledge that public interest in these matters was both widespread and legitimate, while they continued to refuse specific disclosures. They were compelled to engage with questions about classification policies, the scope of secret research, and the principles that governed decisions about what information should be withheld from democratic scrutiny. The Lazar story had opened a door that could never be completely closed. Even critics who disputed the specific claims about alien technology were forced to acknowledge that the level of government secrecy surrounding Area 51 and related facilities raised legitimate questions about accountability and oversight in a democratic society. For Bob Lazar himself, the broadcast represented both vindication and the beginning of a new phase of harassment. No longer protected by anonymity, he became a public figure whose every statement was scrutinized, whose background was investigated by both supporters and critics, whose life became a battleground between those who believed his story and those who were determined to discredit it. The physicist handled the attention with the same matter of demeanor he had displayed throughout the investigation. He continued to maintain that his motivation had been simple. The public had a right to know about research being conducted in their name, especially research that might have profound implications for humanity's future. He had never sought fame or financial gain from his revelations, and the intense scrutiny that followed his emergence as a public figure seemed to cause him genuine discomfort. For George Knapp, the series established his reputation as a journalist willing to pursue important stories, regardless of the personal and professional risks involved. The unprecedented response to the broadcasts validated his decision to take Lazar's claims seriously and invest the time and resources necessary to investigate them thoroughly. But the series also marked the beginning of a new phase in Knapp's career, one that would be forever associated with questions about government secrecy, unexplained phenomena, and the search for truth in areas where powerful interests preferred darkness. He had crossed a line from conventional journalism into territory where normal rules didn't apply and where the stakes went far beyond ratings or reputation. The broadcast, though, was intended to reveal the truth about one man's extraordinary claims, had instead opened questions about the nature of truth itself in a society where the most important secrets were protected by methods that democracy would never openly acknowledge. The desert had yielded some of its secrets, but in doing so, it had revealed that the deepest mysteries were not about alien technology, but about the shadowy apparatus of control that governed what Americans were allowed to know about their own government. The transformation was complete. George Knapp had entered the investigation as a skeptical journalist seeking to debunk an extraordinary claim. He emerged as a believer not necessarily in alien visitation, but in the fundamental importance of truth-telling in a democracy and the right of citizens to know what was being done in their name with their resources. The story had changed both men forever, but its most profound impact might be on the millions of viewers who had been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of reality, the extent of government secrecy, and the possibility that humanity was not alone in the universe. The broadcast was over, but the mystery it had revealed was just beginning to unfold. Chapter 10. The ripple effect in the days and weeks following the final broadcast of UFOs. The best evidence. Las Vegas felt different to those who had been touched by the story. The desert city had always been a place where the impossible seemed plausible, where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card, where reality itself seemed more negotiable than in other places. But now it had become ground zero for a cultural shift that would ripple outward across the country and around the world. The immediate response was overwhelming and unprecedented. KLAs received thousands of phone calls, letters, and faxes from viewers who wanted more information, who had their own stories to tell, or who simply wanted to express their gratitude for a mainstream news organization finally taking these questions seriously. The station's small public affairs department found itself transformed overnight into an informal clearinghouse for UFO reports and government secrecy. Claims from around the world, but it wasn't just believers who were responding. The series had attracted attention from some of the most credible observers of aerospace technology, government policy, and scientific research. Former military officers began coming forward with their own accounts of unusual phenomena and classified programs. Scientists started discussing the theoretical possibilities that Lazar had described. Engineers began analyzing the technical claims with the seriousness they deserved. Perhaps most significantly, the story had forced a shift in how mainstream media approached the entire subject of unexplained phenomena. No longer could these topics be dismissed automatically as the province of cranks and conspiracy theorists. The KLAS series had demonstrated that serious journalism could be applied to extraordinary claims, that institutional credibility could survive contact with controversial subjects, and that public interest in these matters was both widespread and legitimate. Other news organizations began developing their own investigations into government secrecy surrounding Area 51 and related facilities, while few were willing to embrace Lazar's specific claims about alien technology. Many found the questions about classification policies, oversight mechanisms, and democratic accountability compelling enough to pursue. The story had created a permission structure for serious journalists to ask serious questions about matters that had previously been relegated to the tabloid press. The series also changes within the UFO research community itself. For decades, the field had been dominated by amateur investigators working with limited resources and no access to mainstream media outlets. The Lazar story demonstrated that extraordinary claims could receive serious treatment from credible institutions if they were presented with sufficient evidence and appropriate context. More importantly, it showed that public interest in these matters was far greater than anyone had realized. The response to the KLAS series suggested that millions of people had been waiting for someone with institutional credibility to address these questions, that there was a vast audience hungry for serious treatment of subjects that had been marginalized for too long. Government response to that series was muted, but telling. While officials continued to refuse comment on specific claims about classified activities, they were forced to acknowledge that public interest in these matters was legitimate and that some level of transparency about general policies might be necessary to maintain public trust. The Pentagon began releasing limited information about the existence of Area 51, acknowledging for the first time that there was indeed a classified facility at Groom Lake, though refusing to provide details about activities conducted there. This represented a significant departure from previous policies that had maintained the fiction that no such facility existed. More subtly, The series had changed the terms of debate about government secrecy itself. Previously, discussions about classification had focused primarily on national security implications, whether specific disclosures might benefit foreign adversaries or compromise ongoing operations. The Lazar story introduced questions about the democratic implications of secrecy, whether citizens in a free society had the right to know about research conducted in their name, especially research that might have profound implications for humanity's future. These questions became more urgent as the Cold War ended and traditional justifications for extreme secrecy became less compelling. If the Soviet threat that had justified decades of classification was diminishing, what rationale existed for maintaining such extensive barriers to public knowledge? If American democracy was robust enough to survive the end of ideological competition with communism, why wasn't it strong enough to handle the truth about government research programs? The international response to the series was equally significant. News organizations around the world picked up the story, often treating it more seriously than their American counterparts. Foreign governments began releasing their own UFO-related files, acknowledging that they too had been investigating unexplained phenomena and that some of their findings remained classified for reasons that had nothing to do with national security. This international openness created additional pressure on American officials to justify their continued secrecy. If democratic allies were willing to discuss their UFO investigations openly, what made American research so much more sensitive that it required absolute classification? The scientific community's response was complex and evolving. While many researchers initially dismissed Lazar's claims as impossible, others found elements of his technical descriptions worthy of serious consideration. The physicist's predictions about element 115, in particular, were noted by nuclear researchers who recognized that his understanding of theoretical physics was more sophisticated than many critics acknowledged. More importantly, the series had raised questions about the relationship between government-funded research and public knowledge. If breakthrough discoveries were being made at classified facilities, what justified keeping that knowledge from the broader scientific community? How many potential advances were being delayed or prevented by excessive secrecy surrounding research that might have civilian applications? These questions resonated particularly strongly in universities and research institutions where scientists were struggling with funding, limitations and technological barriers that might be solvable if they had access to classified research. The Lazar story suggested that solutions to some of humanity's greatest challenges might already exist in secret facilities, withheld from public benefit for reasons that had more to do with control than security. Bob Lazar himself became a reluctant celebrity, thrust into a spotlight he had never sought and seemed genuinely uncomfortable occupying. Unlike many who claimed extraordinary experiences with UFO phenomena, Lazar consistently avoided opportunities for fame or profit. He declined most interview requests, refused to write books about his experiences, and generally tried to return to a normal life despite the impossibility of complete anonymity. His behavior reinforced the credibility of his initial claims. People seeking attention or financial gain from UFO stories typically embraced every opportunity for publicity. Lazar's apparent desire to escape public scrutiny was more consistent with someone who had reluctantly revealed classified information out of conscience rather than self-interest. The harassment that both Lazar and Knapp had experienced during the investigation continued after the broadcasts, but it took on new characteristics. No longer could intimidation be conducted in complete secrecy. Too many people were now watching. Too many journalists were paying attention. The crude tactics of breaking into homes and following cars were replaced by more sophisticated methods of pressure and discreditation. Found his professional opportunities limited as word spread through the scientific community that he was associated with controversial claims about alien technology. Employers became reluctant to hire someone who might attract unwanted government attention. Colleagues distanced themselves to protect their own careers and security clearances. For Knapp, the professional consequences were more complex. While the series had established his reputation as an investigative journalist willing to tackle controversial subjects, it had also typecast him as someone whose credibility was forever linked to extraordinary claims that many in mainstream journalism remained uncomfortable addressing. Yet, the series had also opened new opportunities. Other whistleblowers began approaching Knapp with their own stories about government secrecy, classified research, and hidden activities that deserved public scrutiny. The Lazar investigation had demonstrated that mainstream journalism could be applied successfully to subjects that had previously been dismissed as beyond serious consideration. The long-term impact of the series extended far beyond the immediate questions about Bob Lazar's credibility or the existence of alien technology at Area 51. It had fundamentally changed the conversation about government secrecy, scientific transparency, and the public's right to know about research conducted with taxpayer funding. More subtly, it had challenged one of the foundational assumptions of modern American society, that democratic institutions could be trusted to make important decisions about classification and disclosure without meaningful oversight or accountability. Chapter 11. The persistent questions. Years passed like desert winds over the Nevada landscape, carrying away the immediate sensation of the Bob Lazar story, but leaving behind questions that refused to be buried by time or dismissal. As the 1990s progressed into the new millennium, the fundamental issues raised by that November BROADCAST in 1989 only grew more pressing and more relevant to a society grappling with expanding government power and diminishing transparency. George Knapp found himself in the peculiar position of being simultaneously vindicated and marginalized by subsequent developments. Element 115, which Lazar had described in such detail 15 years before its official discovery, was finally synthesized in laboratories exactly as the physicist had predicted. While the created element was highly unstable and bore none of the exotic properties Lazar claimed to have observed, its very existence validated at least part of his technical narrative in ways that seemed to transcend coincidence. Other aspects of Lazar's story also received unexpected corroboration from official sources. The Pentagon's gradual acknowledgement of Area 51's existence, the release of previously classified UFO documents, and the admission by government officials that unexplained aerial phenomena had indeed been systematically investigated, all lent credibility to claims that had once been dismissed as fantasy. But perhaps more significantly, the questions raised by the Lazar investigation became increasingly relevant to broader concerns about government accountability and democratic oversight. The methods used to intimidate sources, suppress information, and manipulate public perception during the original investigation proved to be harbingers of tactics that would become increasingly common in other contexts. the apparatus of secrecy that had been deployed against Lazar and his supporters revealed capabilities and willingness to operate outside normal legal constraints that would later be employed in numerous other cases involving whistleblowers, journalists, and citizens who attempted to reveal information that powerful interests preferred to keep hidden. Edward Snowden's revelations about NSA surveillance programs, Chelsea Manning's disclosure of military documents, and numerous other cases of government whistleblowing would follow patterns remarkably similar to those established during the Lazar affair: systematic harassment of sources, intimidation of journalists, and the use of classification authority to conceal activities that had little to do with legitimate national security concerns. The Lazar case had provided an early glimpse into a system of control that operated in the shadows of American democracy, accountable to no elected authority and constrained by no constitutional limitations. What had seemed like an isolated incident involving claims about alien technology was revealed to be part of a much larger pattern of government overreach and democratic erosion. Bob Lazar himself remained an enigma, consistently declining opportunities for fame or profit that would have been available to someone willing to embellish or sensationalize his story. His continued insistence on the basic facts of his account, despite decades of criticism and investigation, suggested either an extraordinary commitment to an elaborate hoax or a genuine desire to reveal information he believed was important for public welfare. The physicist's technical knowledge continued to impress experts who examined his claims with open minds. His understanding of advanced physics concepts, his detailed descriptions of engineering systems, and his accurate predictions about future scientific developments all suggested someone with genuine expertise rather than a clever fabricator relying on science fiction concepts. Yet questions about his educational background remained unresolved, creating a puzzle that defied simple explanation. The systematic denial of his credentials by institutions where he claimed to have studied was either evidence of an elaborate personal mythology or proof of a cover-up that extended far beyond anything previously documented in American government secrecy. For George Knapp, the persistence of these questions validated his original decision to take Lazar's claims seriously. While specific details of the physicist's story might remain unverified, the broader patterns of government secrecy, scientific compartmentalization, and democratic accountability that the investigation had revealed were clearly authentic and important. The journalist had evolved from a local news anchor into one of the most respected investigators of government secrecy and unexplained phenomena. His work had inspired other journalists to pursue similar stories, created a template for serious investigation of extraordinary claims, and demonstrated that mainstream journalism could be applied successfully to subjects that had previously been relegated to the margins of public discourse. But the story had also exacted a personal cost that became more apparent with the passage of time. Both Lazar and Knapp had sacrificed normal careers and conventional success for the opportunity to reveal information they believed was too important to suppress. Their lives had been forever altered by their brief encounter with secrets that powerful interests were determined to protect. The harassment they had experienced during the original investigation continued in more subtle forms for years afterward. Professional opportunities were limited, personal relationships were strained, and the constant awareness of being watched and monitored created psychological burdens that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore, yet neither man expressed regret about their decision to pursue the story. They had witnessed evidence of government activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about democracy, accountability, and the public's right to know about research conducted with taxpayer funding. The importance of revealing that information outweighed the personal costs of doing so. The persistent questions raised by their investigation had also contributed to broader changes in public expectations about government transparency, while officials continued to claim broad classification authority. Citizens became increasingly skeptical of secrecy claims that seemed designed more to protect institutional embarrassment than legitimate security. Concerns the Internet revolution that occurred during the years following the Lazar broadcasts created new opportunities for information sharing that made traditional secrecy methods less effective. Documents that might once have been buried in classified files could now be distributed instantly around the world. Witnesses who might once have been intimidated into silence could now find sympathetic audiences and protective communities online. These technological changes didn't eliminate government secrecy, but they made it more difficult to maintain and more expensive to enforce. The methods that had been used against Lazar and his sources were still available to those who wanted to suppress inconvenient information, but they were no longer sufficient to guarantee success. The questions that had emerged from the Nevada desert in 1989 were no longer isolated inquiries about one man's extraordinary claims. They had become part of a broader conversation about the nature of democratic governance in an era of expanding executive power and diminishing legislative oversight. What citizens had the right to know about government activities conducted in their name, what legitimate justifications existed for withholding information about scientific research funded with public resources. How could democratic institutions maintain accountability when their most important activities were concealed behind walls of classification that seemed to grow higher and thicker with each passing year? These questions had been crystallized by the Bob Lazar story, but they extended far beyond any specific claims about alien technology or secret facilities. They went to the heart of what it meant to live in a free society where government derived its authority from the consent of the governed. The desert had revealed more than anyone had expected when two men first began asking uncomfortable questions about impossible technologies and classified facilities. It had exposed the existence of a parallel system of governance that operated by different rules, answered to different authorities, and considered itself accountable only to interests that remained hidden from democratic scrutiny. The persistent questions raised by that revelation were still echoing across the landscape of American politics and society, demanding answers that might be even more important than any secrets buried beneath the Nevada sand. Chapter 12. The Desert's Ultimate Secret. Our journey through this labyrinth of secrets, lies, and extraordinary possibilities draws toward its conclusion. We must confront a truth that may be more unsettling than any claim about alien technology or government cover-ups. The ultimate secret hidden in the Nevada desert may not be about visitors from other worlds, but about the nature of power itself in a society that claims to be governed by the consent of its people. The story of Bob Lazar and George Knapp began with questions about exotic materials and impossible propulsion systems. It evolved into an investigation of government secrecy and democratic accountability, but at its deepest level, it revealed something that challenges the foundational assumptions of American democracy, the existence of a parallel system of governance that operates beyond constitutional constraints and answers to no elected authority, the apparatus of control that emerged from the shadows during the Lazar investigation possessed capabilities that should not exist in a free society. It could monitor private communications, track personal movements, intimidate witnesses, and manipulate information with impunity. It could erase employment records, deny documented histories, and make inconvenient people disappear from official memory as if they had never existed. Most disturbing of all, it could do these things without oversight, without accountability, and without limitation. The harassment campaign against Lazar and his sources operated outside legal boundaries, employed methods that violated numerous constitutional protections, and served interests that remained hidden from democratic scrutiny. This revelation was more profound than any claims about extraterrestrial visitation, even if every specific detail of Lazar's story proved to be false. The investigation had exposed a system of power that was fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance. Citizens who discovered the existence of this system were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their government possessed capabilities and demonstrated willingness to use them in ways that most Americans would find shocking and unacceptable if they were fully aware of them. The Lazar case provided a window into this hidden world, but it was not an isolated incident. The same methods, the same capabilities, and the same willingness to operate outside legal constraints would resurface repeatedly in subsequent decades as other whistleblowers attempted to reveal classified information that they believed was important for public welfare. The pattern established during the Lazar investigation, systematic harassment of sources, intimidation of journalists, manipulation of official records, and the use of classification authority to conceal activities unrelated to legitimate security concerns would become a template for suppressing inconvenient information across a wide range of subjects. But the desert had also revealed something else: the power of individual courage in the face of institutional intimidation. Two men, armed with nothing more than curiosity and conscience, had managed to expose secrets that powerful interests were determined to protect. Their investigation had not solved all the mysteries surrounding Area 51 and related facilities, but it had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated apparatus of secrecy was not impervious to determined inquiry. The questions they raised could not be unasked. The documents they uncovered could not be and the witnesses they found could not be silenced forever, despite the best efforts of those who preferred darkness to light. Truth had a way of emerging from even the deepest burial grounds of classification and denial. George Knapp's transformation from skeptical journalist to committed investigator of government secrecy represented something larger than personal evolution. It symbolized the awakening of democratic consciousness in the face of institutional deception, the recognition that citizens could not remain passive consumers of official information if they wanted to preserve the freedoms that democracy was supposed to protect. The physicist's willingness to risk everything to reveal information he believed was important for public welfare demonstrated that individual conscience could still triumph over institutional pressure, that some truths were too important to suppress regardless of personal cost. But perhaps the most significant revelation of the entire investigation was the discovery of how many people were waiting for someone to ask these questions seriously. The overwhelming response to the KLAS broadcasts revealed a hunger for truth that had been suppressed but never eliminated, a public desire for accountability that had been frustrated but not destroyed. Millions of Americans, it turned out, had been harboring the same suspicions, the same questions, the same sense that important information was being withheld from them by institutions that claimed to serve their interests. The Lazar story provided a focal point for these concerns, a specific case that illustrated broader patterns of secrecy and control that extended far beyond any single facility or program. The ultimate secret of the Nevada desert was not about extraterrestrial technology or alien visitation. It was about the fundamental question of who really governed America and in whose interests that governance was conducted. The investigation had revealed that beneath the familiar structures of democratic accountability lay a shadow system of power that operated by different rules and served different masters. This system was not accountable to voters, not constrained by constitutional limitations, and not concerned with the consent of the governed. It derived its authority not from democratic mandate, but from its ability to control information, manipulate perception, and intimidate opposition. Its power rested not on public support, but on public ignorance of its very existence. The desert had yielded this secret reluctantly, gradually, and only in response to persistent inquiry that refused to be discouraged by harassment, intimidation, or official denial. But once revealed, the secret could not be concealed again. The knowledge that such a system existed changed everything for those who possessed it, creating an obligation to remain vigilant against its expansion and committed to its eventual exposure. As the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns above the Nevada wilderness, casting shadows that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the ultimate mystery remained unsolved. Not the mystery of what technologies might be hidden in underground facilities, but the mystery of whether democratic societies could survive when their most important decisions were made by people whose identities, motivations, and ultimate goals remained hidden from those who had supposedly elected them to serve the public interest. The desert kept its secrets, but it had revealed enough to change the lives of those who had dared to ask the right questions. In the end, that might be the most important revelation of all. That truth was still possible in a world of lies. That courage could still triumph over intimidation, and that the vast majority of people, when given the choice between comfortable ignorance and uncomfortable knowledge, would choose knowledge every time. The mystery continued. But it was no longer a mystery that only two men were trying to solve. The desert had found its voice, and it was speaking through anyone brave enough to ask the questions that power preferred to leave unasked. Epilogue: from skeptic to believer, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the Nevada desert holds its breath between the dying of night and the birth of day, George Knapp sometimes finds himself standing at his window, looking out toward the distant mountains that guard America's deepest secrets. More than 3 decades have passed since that first phone call from Bob Lazar. More than 3 decades since a routine interview became a journey into the heart of mysteries that continue to challenge everything we think we know about reality, government, and truth itself. The transformation promised in our title from skeptic to believer proved to be more complex and more profound than either man could have anticipated when they first began their dangerous dance around classified information and impossible claims. Knapp had indeed been transformed, but not in the simple way that phrase might suggest. He had not merely exchanged doubt for certainty, skepticism for credulity. Instead, he had discovered that the most important transformations occur in the space between belief and disbelief, in the recognition that the most significant questions are often those that cannot be answered definitively but must be pursued. Regardless, the believer that emerged from decades of investigation was not someone who had found comfortable certainties to replace uncomfortable doubts. He was someone who had learned to live with mystery, to pursue truth even when that pursuit led into territories where traditional journalistic methods proved inadequate, where normal standards of evidence seemed insufficient, and where the stakes went far beyond ratings or reputation. Bob Lazar had changed George Knapp forever, but not by convincing him that alien spacecraft were being studied in underground facilities beneath the Nevada desert. The physicist's real impact was more subtle and more lasting. He had demonstrated that extraordinary claims could emerge from credible sources, that government secrecy extended far beyond what most citizens imagined, and that the apparatus of power in America included capabilities and willingness to use them that challenged fundamental assumptions about democratic governance. The specific details of Lazar's story, the 9 craft, the element 115 fuel, the gravity amplifiers, the briefings about extraterrestrial visitation remained unproven and perhaps unprovable through conventional means. But the broader patterns his case had revealed were undeniably real and undeniably significant. The systematic erasure of his employment records, the harassment campaign against him and his supporters, the intimidation of potential witnesses, and the use of classification authority to conceal activities that seemed unrelated to legitimate security concerns were all documented. Facts that spoke to realities far more disturbing than any claims about alien technology. These patterns would resurface repeatedly in subsequent decades as other whistleblowers attempted to reveal information they believed was important for public welfare. Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Reality Winner, and numerous others would face harassment, persecution, and imprisonment for revealing government activities that challenged official narratives about democracy, accountability, and the rule of law. The template established during the Lazar investigation's systematic efforts to discredit sources, intimidate journalists, and suppress information through legal and extra-legal means would become increasingly visible as the methods of control that had once operated entirely in shadows were forced into partial visibility by technological changes and evolving public expectations about transparency. George Knapp's transformation had prepared him to recognize and investigate these patterns when they emerged in other contexts. His experience with the Lazar case had taught him to look beyond specific claims to the broader systems of power they revealed, to understand that the most important stories were often about the methods used to suppress information rather than the information itself. The journalist who had once been primarily concerned with verifying facts and presenting balanced perspectives had evolved into someone who understood that balance itself could be a form of bias when one side possessed overwhelming advantages in resources, authority, and access to classified information. Traditional journalistic objectivity was inadequate when dealing with sources who faced persecution for their disclosures and subjects that powerful interests were determined to keep hidden. The believer that Knapp had become believed not in any particular theory about extraterrestrial visitation or advanced technology, but in the fundamental importance of asking uncomfortable questions and pursuing inconvenient truths, regardless of personal cost. He had learned that skepticism and belief were not opposites, but complementary aspects of the search for truth. That genuine inquiry required both the skeptic's demand for evidence and the believer's willingness to consider possibilities that challenged conventional. Understanding this transformation had come at significant personal cost. Both Knapp and Lazar had sacrificed conventional success and normal lives for the opportunity to reveal information they believed was too important to suppress. Their careers had been forever altered by their brief encounter with secrets that powerful interests were determined to protect. Their reputations had become permanently linked to extraordinary claims that many in mainstream society remained uncomfortable discussing, yet neither man had expressed regret about their decision to pursue the story. They had witnessed evidence of government activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about democracy, accountability, and the public's right to know about research conducted with taxpayer funding. The importance of revealing that evidence outweighed the personal costs of doing so. The legacy of their investigation extended far beyond any specific claims about Area 51 or alien technology. They had demonstrated that mainstream journalism could be applied successfully to subjects that had previously been dismissed as beyond serious consideration. They had shown that institutional credibility could survive contact with controversial topics if those topics were approached with appropriate rigor and context. They had proven that public interest in these matters was far greater than anyone had realized and far more sophisticated than critics had assumed. Most importantly, they had established that the questions raised by government secrecy, scientific compartmentalization, and democratic accountability were legitimate subjects for public discourse and investigative journalism. These questions had not been resolved by their work, but they had been raised in ways that could not be ignored or dismissed by future generations of journalists, researchers, and citizens, as the desert sunrise painted the Nevada mountains in shades of gold and crimson, washing away the shadows that had hidden so many secrets for so many years. The transformation was complete, but the mystery remained. Bob Lazar had changed George Knapp forever, not by providing him with comfortable answers, but by forcing him to confront uncomfortable questions that would shape the rest of his career and, perhaps more importantly, the rest of his life. The skeptic had become a believer, but what he believed in was not any particular explanation for unexplained phenomena. What he believed in was the possibility of truth in a world of lies, the importance of courage in a time of intimidation, and the fundamental principle that citizens in a free society had the right to know what was being done in their name with their resources. The desert had revealed its deepest secret after all, that the most profound mysteries were not about what might be hidden in underground facilities, but about whether democratic societies could survive when their most important decisions were made by people whose identities, motivations, and ultimate goals remained hidden from those who had supposedly chosen them to serve the public interest. In the end, the transformation from skeptic to believer was not about accepting extraordinary claims, but about recognizing extraordinary responsibilities. The responsibility to ask difficult questions, to pursue inconvenient truths, and to remember that in a democracy, the ultimate authority rested not with those who possessed classified information, but with the citizens, who had the courage to demand that such information be used in their interests, rather than against them. The story of Bob Lazar and George Knapp had begun with claims about impossible technologies and ended with revelations about the nature of power itself. The desert had yielded some of its secrets, but in doing so, It had revealed that the greatest mysteries were not about visitors from other worlds, but about the shadow world that governed this. 1. The believer that George Knapp had become would continue asking questions, continue pursuing truth, continue serving as a bridge between the comfortable certainties of conventional journalism and the uncomfortable possibilities that lay hidden in the vast expanse of classified information that surrounded American democracy. Like a wall of silence, the transformation was complete. But the journey was far from over. In the desert that stretched endlessly toward horizons that promised both revelation and mystery, the work of democracy continued, one question at a time, one investigation at a time, one courageous act of truth-telling at a time. The stars that had witnessed it all continued their eternal dance above the Nevada wilderness, keeping their own counsel about the secrets still buried in the sand below, waiting for the next generation of skeptics who might be brave enough to become believers in the power of truth.